Good evening. Thank you very much for showing up for what is the fourth talk this semester of the Technology, Innovation, and Global Security Speakers Series of the Strauss Center's ongoing program of events on campus. I'm Ken Flam. I'd like to welcome you. We have an excellent speaker lined up this afternoon, an appropriate and worthy continuing element in our program after what the spectacular series of talks we've had this semester. Bill Spencer, at this point, usually makes a couple of administrative announcements for those of our students who show up for these talks. I'm going to briefly interject that I'm actually going to take care of the administrative stuff offline afterwards, but I have to apologize that Bill Spencer is going to be unable to attend the entire talk this evening. He, unfortunately, his daughter is having back surgery, and he was sort of taken away to attend to that. He may be able to join us late, but unfortunately, Bill is not going to be here for most of the talk tonight, and extends his regrets at not being able to hear from Dan. And without further ado, I think I'd like to introduce Dan Hutcheson, who's the CEO of VLSI Research, one of the most widely quoted and well-known firms in the semiconductor industry. As Sanjay Banerjee was saying a moment ago, everyone seems to be reading Dan's columns at some point. And so we have news on the hoof here tonight. We have an unpublished column about to issue forth, and I know we're all eagerly anticipating it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dan Hutcheson. Dan, you want to talk at all about your background, or yeah? Why don't you just tell us for a few minutes?
Well, in fact, it's really an honor to be able to talk here, and I like talking to students, especially students of your caliber, because you can kind of take some of the ideas that we do and take them forward. I'm a real believer that research should be done in universities, not in labs. And I've spent the better part of my career doing helping people try to figure out how to make up money out of technology, which is a very difficult thing. I actually I'm an economist by training, and when I was in college, you get the stuff as an economist. There's three factors of production. There's labor, land, and capital. And being in Silicon Valley, my dad being a device physicist, I said, well, what about innovation? And they said, well, that's just something that people haven't done a lot of, that there's not much literature on it. So this was about 35 years ago, and I said, well, that sounds like a great place to start a career. And so far, it's been a good place. And so what I want to talk about is what I think is the fourth factor of production, and that's innovation. And innovation is really critical to any economy, and I think more and more economists and business leaders are beginning to find that out. And one of my beefs over the past 10 to 20 years that I know I've expressed to Ken over time is that the way the Fed just injects money into the economy or pulls it out by changing interest rates, the assumption is that it's very generic across the economy. And what's really happened is it's pushed a lot of manufacturing out, because manufacturing needs a little more consistency than that. And so it's a very interesting thing. And also the way we measure businesses is not conducive to innovation. And so I'm going to talk about that tonight. And this all started about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's actually culminated in this website I created called wesearch.com, which is a Science 2.0 site. And what I saw was research was getting very expensive, and as a result, it was getting very global. It was also getting very global because of the internet and the ability to transfer information back and forth across the world. And what this chart shows is it shows the R&D spending per node in the semiconductor industry going all the way back to 1957. And as you can see, it went through this huge growth period. And in 2005, there was a 65 nanometer node. And basically what I did was I accumulated all the R&D that was going on in various parts of the industry. 1957 was a little more difficult because there were no records back then of it. But what I could find is the number of PhDs and engineers working on it. And so from that, you can multiply up what they probably spent to develop the transistor. And so you can see over this 40, 50 year period, it's grown by about 5, 6 orders of magnitude. And that's been a fundamental issue for the industry. And I came here about 4 or 5 years ago and did a presentation for ISME. And the real point was that as we looked at these, and we went into this, let's see if I can find them, get the mouse to work here. Okay, this period here is really the consortia area. You know, Austin is the home of Symantec. It was founded in 1987. And what you notice there is that the research cost, the growth per node, really slowed to about 12% as we started to work in the open model. And you know, the people that are here that are on the computing side know that the open model has been this huge explosion of growth there. And prior to that, most of the research was done in a closed model, and so what you had was a lot of duplicative research, and the actual pre-consortia average growth of research per node was growing at 33%. And so what you see is and what's so special about the open model? It's the fact that people are communicating more, and you get more cross-fertilization of ideas. Now, that sort of led to what I think are some new development paths, and the semiconductor business model. And I think one of the biggest problems in our industry is that the financial community measures us on return on invested capital. And they measure most companies on return on invested capital. Now the problem with that measurement is that capital is all bought externally to your company. It creates the revenues of production, but at the end of the day, it doesn't create the growth in revenues. It doesn't create the profits. It just creates the capacity to produce. And so I introduced this concept of that we should be measuring ourselves on something called ROnR and ROS, and which I'm going to explain to you in a bit. And really, the other thing is to communicate more the new technology, which is Science 2.0, Web 2.0, applied to science, and so that you can have virtual conferencing online 24 hours a day, and not even leave your office and never have to eat rubber chicken again if you don't want to. Now, what's wrong with invested capital? Well, number one is the numerator, the return, is very hard to raise. And so if you're on the financial side of the organization, what do? You start stripping out capital, because it's a lot easier to lower the capital side. So if you look at what TI's done in the last 4 or 5 years, they variabilized their cost, and now they're in trouble. And it was very easy to predict, because as they tried to lower their capital side of their business, all they were really doing was shifting the same capital over offshore, and then they lost their ability to use their manufacturing knowledge to differentiate their product. And that led to the loss of some very big customers like Nokia, who started to look around and find other people to do advanced research with, because they didn't like the idea of doing research on their products in Taiwan. And so there's all kinds of issues like that you get into, but it solves a short-term problem, and that is it raises your return on invested capital. But it doesn't change anything in your business, because if you look at TI, even though the stock price was going up as their return on invested capital was going up, it was just driving their PE up. But their earnings weren't really changing significantly. And so what it does is you wind up leading in the semiconductor industry to a fab-light strategy, which you push your manufacturing out. And fab-light is really just a halfway house to fabless, which if you read my blog on research.com, you can read about why it is a halfway house. I won't spend a lot of time there tonight. But anyway, and the other thing that's wrong with it is it takes the CTO and puts them offline and puts the CFO in the driver's seat of the company. And historically, financial people have done very poor jobs of running companies unless they're financial companies. And the CTO's in the back seat. And the other thing is that once you do that, it focuses your organization on cost, not price. Because the one thing that is the most difficult and it takes the most guts to do is focus your organization on getting the right price, the right value for your product. It's a lot easier to accept the prices that are out there in the market and just drive down your cost and get your margin from driving down your costs. The problem is as you drive down your costs, you drive out your ability to innovate. And you lose that flexibility. And all you've done is create this financial shell game of variabilizing your capital. But it's somewhere else, but it's still there. So the other thing is that it leads to a strong inventory cycle, which I'm going to explain to you here. And it results in higher cycle times in your factories, which means you can respond, you respond less to what's going on. And you have less responsiveness to the market, you create too much inventory, and then you go through these terrible inventory cycles that create big cycles, layoffs, and all that. And eventually, you lose your manufacturing infrastructure. So, and why is that the case? Well, one is that the annual semiconductor revenues is driven by the consumer cycle. And basically, we start off in January, business is really low after Christmas, and more than something like 60–70% occurs in the last 4 months of the year. And so you have this production ramp like that. Now, what happens to your inventory if you're trying to ramp? Well, invariably, what you want to do is build your inventory up to the middle of the year so that you can ship into the end of the year. Now, why do you do that? Well, if I optimize my inventory for the lowest working capital, what happens is that I've got a fundamental problem of matching that to my revenues. So what I really want to do is have my factory capacity at my maximum and simply modulate my factory throughout the range of which I'm producing. The problem with that, though, is that you get a lousy return on invested capital. So the way you deal with this is you shift it offshore to a foundry in Taiwan or China. They build your product, and now you can control your inventory cycle because you've basically shifted those costs out there, and so you lose your manufacturing here. Now, so what's wrong with it? I mean, basically, it's, Lou Gerstner has this great quote that I just love, and he says, you don't get what you expect, you get what you inspect. And if you're inspecting on return on invested capital, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get this response to that curve. And you're going to get this, and you're not going to get the innovation you want. So, and what's the real value here? What's the value of innovation? And really, there's 3 parts to it that I'm going to describe. And that's the research, development, and marketing part of it. And that's where the real seeds of differentiation come from. And in fact, I interviewed Andy Grove for one of my websites called chiphistory.org. And it was real fascinating because I was asking him about the microprocessor in a PC, and he said, well, what we really got right was our manufacturing, our design, and our marketing was all aligned to the customer. And it just worked like clockwork. And then I made the comment to him, I said, well, you're really good at that historically. And he says, no, sometimes we were good and sometimes we were not so good. But the whole thing is that, and I spent my life helping companies do this, and what you look for, if you're looking for a market, you look for a problem, because all problems are markets. Because problems are opportunities for success, and all products are solutions. So you hear all this marketing mumbo-gumbo about our solution and our value proposition for this and that. All they're telling you is a solution is a product. And if you want to provide a solution, you got to find the problem first, because what a lot of companies make the mistake of doing is they create a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. Lasers were a very good example of that for about 40 or 50 years. They were a solution in search of a problem, as some people will say. Now, at the end of the day, you have 2 levers. One is you lower cost, and you focus on cost all the time, which precludes an innovative approach, or you focus on innovation, which brings differentiation and allows you to raise your returns because it separates you from the cost model. Now, so what's ROnR and ROS? Well, what ROnR is it's this idea that I created is that what we should be looking at is a return on N years of RD&E. Okay, and I started with the idea of if research is really so important, it should be creating a return. And actually, it's sort of interesting when you go back and you measure the better companies. All the better companies have a really good return on N years of R&D. Now, the reason why it's N years is you really have to match it to the product cycle. Well, semiconductors, it's very easy because there's a 2-year product cycle. So you can look at a company and you look at your return, look what they spent over 2 years, and see if they're really getting a good return on that. And those companies tend to be the most innovative companies. And then the other one is what's your return on your SG&A, which most people never measure. And that's where all the parties go on, and the fun and the plane trips, and you know, you either get your marketing right and you're aligned to your customer, or you get disjointed where your product marketing and your people developing the products are not in line with the customer. And you know, a classic example of this is about 2 or 3 years ago, Intel got misaligned between with the idea of a 64-bit x86 architecture. And so they were shooting down towards a 32-bit, and they wanted to move the world to Itanium, and so they tried to force the world away from the x86 architecture, but the world didn't want to move. And so AMD ran right up the middle. And so Intel was focusing on its own interest, which was trying to get the return out and trying to force the customer to do what it wanted to do, and AMD found that there was a big hole there for them to fill, and so they went through quite a few years of some really nice growth. So that's what you should be focusing on. So anyway, and what I did was I went in and I said, okay, what does it look like for chip makers? And if we look at the return on sales and marketing, what we can see is it's been steadily growing over time. And as the industry is consolidated, it's getting more efficient. Its sales and marketing has improved. So that's working. But if we look at the return on 2 years of RD&E, what we see is it's basically been pretty lousy since 2000. That it was growing pretty steadily. And I showed you the other chart where you had this growth of 12% a year in research costs. Now, remember, the semiconductor industry grows at about 6 to 7% now. So if you're growing at 12%, if your costs are growing at 12% and your revenues are growing at 6 to 12%, at some point you're not going to be able to afford your revenues, your research. So, and what you've been seeing in that is this steady decline in research, or in return on research. And yet what's interesting is the market's totally missed this because they focused on return on invested capital, which has been just simply moving manufacturing into Asia and moving all those jobs to Asia too, by the way. So, and then when you look at this, what is it that you really have to do in a research management? Because what I found is there's some companies that are really good at research management, and there's some companies that are really bad at it. And basically what you're trying to do is measure this. On this axis is risk value, time to answer, and then down here we have application. And you start off here with what's the simple and easy things that you can do that bring money in. And over here are what are the complex things that you can do to bring money in. And if you look at the application, basically the concept is that if you do something too easy, in fact, some people call this the Goldilocks strategy. If it's too easy, everybody can do it, and you're never going to make any money. If it's too complex, you can't even do it, and you're just going to burn a lot of money chasing after it, like gallium arsenide integrated circuits is a very good example of that. And so what you really need to do is somehow balance between what the application is that your customer needs to do and what it's going to cost you to make that discovery. And the discovery tends to be more of a fat, and so what happens is it tends to be more of a bulge from your application curve in terms of where your revenue is going to come from, and so that's where your profit is. And that's basically what the better companies do. Now, and what's the chain here of differentiation? Basically, we have this chain of there's RD&E, SG&A, and the customer, right? And the idea is that innovation goes one way and more money comes back, and usually there's not much communication between these different groups historically. Now, and if we look at the R&D, the old model, basically R&D was very disconnected from the customer. And so you had the R&D guys, they spent their time at conferences giving papers and looking really important. The people that did the SG&A that brought in the sales, they were the rainmakers, so they made all the real money, and then the customer was kind of left out. Now, if you look at it, it's really pretty incomprehensible. These are all my photos, by the way. I don't know. I hope you really like them. Anyway, the history of research starts with Edison creating the first corporate research lab in the early 1900s, late 1800s. And his idea was that the idea created the product, and that came from innovation. And so if you invested in research with an eye towards understanding what the problem is and creating products, you would create revenue growth for your company. And that got totally messed up by AT&T, because AT&T came into the world and they were a regulated monopoly. Now, when you're a regulated monopoly, you have one really big problem, and that is the only way you can grow your revenues is to grow your cost, because your profits are controlled. So they started throwing money at research. And the idea was it's just a good idea to do money in research. And so they were researching all kinds of stuff that never amounted to anything. And probably, one of the great examples of that is Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center that Bill Spencer ran. That group created all of the ideas, almost all the ideas and the innovation that was needed to create the modern PC computing infrastructure. The mouse, the GUI, all that stuff, to make PCs usable by just anybody. And no one in Xerox understood what to do with it. It wasn't their product, it wasn't their area, it wasn't aligned to them. And so it took someone like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates to really make it into a real product. And basically the idea was that you just spent money. And we can't do that anymore because the costs are getting too expensive. So what's the new model? The new model is that, and I really believe this is that you still have the same sort of alignment between research, development, and engineering, but back here in research you focus on the universities, and then you focus on consortia, and then finally other people's ideas, or OPI. And why is this really important? I don't believe that any corporation should ever do basic research, as an economist and all the studies I've done, because I can't find companies that have ever been able to get anything out of basic research. If you look at Intel, Intel's created this idea that this is sort of based on the pipeline model is that you have to understand the research infrastructure that's out there and then feed down to your end product. Now, why would you want to do research in the universities besides the fact that it's incredibly cheap compared to doing it in a corporate lab? Well, if you look at the latency of technology, it's about 30 years from idea to real product. A lot of people don't realize it, but the semiconductor was really invented and patented in the early 1930s. All Bell Labs did was discover the materials to make it possible to make a transistor, but the basic concepts were in there, and actually there were some people in Russia that they've now found actually had the ideas a little earlier. The problem was they didn't have the materials to make it possible. And if you look at a lot of other technology, you have this 30-year latency. So you think about it, if you do research in a corporate lab or in a government-sponsored lab, what happens 30 years from now if you got a bunch of 40-year-olds creating this? They're now 70. All your stuff is on a nice bookshelf, but it just lays there. And in fact, I remember one point, one of my real epiphanies was we were sitting there one day and my dad was reading electronic news, and he's reading about all of the work that was done to create virtually uncrackable codes to secure communications over the internet, and that you could just buy it now. And he'd actually worked on this in the 1960s, and he was really amazed because he says, these guys have basically duplicated all the work we did for the military in the 1960s. And it had been on bookshelves and whatnot, and it just was lying there dormant until somebody else invented it and completely independent. In fact, one of the things I actually learned in college was his economist invented calculus in the 30s. And because if you read John Keynes' work, The General Theory, he's basically inventing calculus verbally. So it's sort of an interesting idea. So, but the whole point here is to deal with the timeline of the people that you're working with. So when you get to the fact that you can really make a business and you can make profit out of it and you can create jobs, it ought to be way out here in the development and engineering level. And if it's back here with the research, you need to be funding the basic research in an open environment with young people, because those young people are going to be the ones that really lever the future. They're the ones that create the future, make the businesses, and create the jobs for all of us. So what's the new model? Basically, now what you do is you have innovation and total alignment of purpose, and then you get even more money, hopefully. And Intel's been a very good model for this historically, and I've worked a lot with them, so I understand how they've done it historically. And it's been just fascinating to watch them sort of develop this, and it does work. You do generate lots of profits. Now, the key thing to go away with here is that it's people that make this possible. It's not technology. It's never about technology. The money helps, but the money is just the lubricant that makes it happen. And so what really has worked to make our R&D more efficient and get more innovation is to create a lot more community, a lot more collaboration. And historically we've gone to conferences, and if you go back, the Germans created the university system in the 1800s, and then Edison creates the research lab, and somewhere in the early 1900s we start to get professional associations like the IEEE, and they hold conferences. They have these learned papers where you now have the research. Now, and then in the 1980s, Sematech starts the consortium movement, which is probably the biggest open collaboration thing that was ever created up until that point. And it started as just a national thing, then it became an international way of collaborating to keep this engine going. And the funny thing is that today we're an industry that does not use the technology that we created. We do very little things more than just emailing each other. And there's very little use of the internet other than to post advertisements on websites and just sort of your corporate position, that sort of thing. So we really don't use that, and there's been this evolution. And in fact, one of the things that got me going on it was writing all this stuff about what was wrong with research on one side of our business, and on the other side of our business, which was the operational side, doing all this programming and stuff to have our internet sites and database management and things like that our customers could come in and access our databases real time, have the latest data. They knew they had the latest data, as opposed to in the old days when we shipped them paper. And it was an amazing thing, but it was also a very expensive thing to do in terms of coding things. But so the idea was if we could take the conference and make it real time, what would happen? And so what is Science 2.0? Science 2.0 is something that Diana Roten, who's the program director for the Office of Cyber Infrastructure at the National Science Foundation, came up with. And basically, her idea, and I'm calling it Roten's Law, no one else has ever called it that, and I like to say that because you never get a law named after you if you name it yourself. It's only if somebody else does it. So I want to give her the honor of that, because her idea is that you take Moore's Law, which has been growing the complexity of computing consistently over time, you add scientific complexity to it and the growing complexity of science, and then you multiply that times the digital culture that's evolved in the last 30 to 40 years, and what you get is Science 2.0. And if you look at that, what is the difference? I mean, we're dealing with terabytes and petabytes of data today. We're doing, if you look at the publications, we've gone from publishing formulas to doing full simulation and visualization of things. In the journals, we now have wikis and blogs and all kinds of stuff going on that's changing stuff. And there's just this massive amount of collaboration that's going on. And it's also amazing because the collaboration is global. I posted this thing on chiphistory.org that I created that was a picture of a ladybug and a wafer, and it just zoomed down on the ladybug to teach kids what a micron was and what a nanometer was. And in the end, it gets down and it shows just the little hair on the ladybug's paw. And then I asked the question, well, what if a nanometer was a meter? What would it be like? And this ladybug would be as big as a football stadium. And so I show this picture. Well, then I just posted it on the internet. And then about 6 months later, I get this email from the Science Museum in Bern, Switzerland, and they want a copy of this presentation to put in their museum for the kids there. That couldn't have happened historically. They probably would have never found it. And I actually had the slides for about 30 years, 20, 30 years, that someone had given to me that had this ladybug image done, and decided I would put it up. So it's just amazing what is going on with innovation today. And the other thing about innovation is you're competing with everybody in the world. Our company has about 25 people, of which 10 of them are in India. You know, and we do all kinds of programming and coding there in India. And we basically look for the largest people. So if a 25-person company can do that, and also about 60% of our sales are outside the United States. We sell a password to our VLSIresearch.com site. It's $60,000 a year. It's an amazing new world that we're in, and it's being driven by our ability to do all of this computing in Moore's law and this whole culture. Now, the other thing that she talks about is we're going from facility to facility, that's F2F, to virtual worlds. And really, I invite you to, this is too complex to kind of go over here, but I invite you to look at it more later when you get a chance to look at the presentation. But basically, the whole point of what the internet does is it's a time compressor. And it basically compresses distance and time. And the interesting thing from history is that if you look at where all the languages develop in Europe, what you find is there's always a river or a mountain range or whatnot that creates these differences. And then when the French put the train from Paris to Lyon, what happened was the language between southern France and northern France began to merge. Because as people began to go back and forth, they needed to communicate more, and so you began to get a common language occurring, a common French language that then emerged out of that. There was no such thing as France in those days, and in the early days. And in fact, the people that teach history here, I'm sure will teach you that the concept of a nation is an artifact. Well, and so if we look at the world, we have the same time synchronous, and then we have the different times asynchronous, and then we have what's our geographic place, different versus the same. And what the internet allows us to do is work different times asynchronously in different places. And it's just, and that's the way the world is today. And so we're creating these virtual organizations that actually work. And the other thing you see is, I don't know, have anybody heard of hoteling? You know, hoteling is where the company tries to save money by not giving everybody a cubicle, and you work out of your house, and then you go, when you need to go into the office, you have a little place where you can go and you get a desktop and you put your laptop there and work there. And it's actually been a very productive thing going on. And so all of this is being created by this thing called the transistor that was invented about a half century ago. So what's Science 2.0 today? I'm just going to show you our website. Because we created this, and there's electronics, medical, energy, and anybody can post anything here. It's free. You can read what other researchers are writing about. You can read the news. There's a great news aggregator, so if you want to read about semiconductors, or you want to look at medical imaging and just look at news for medical imaging, you can go and just click on that, and it just pulls up all the RSS feeds that are there that you can then link out to other publications to. So that's and to me the amazing thing is that we started this in February of 2007, and we'd never had a website that did more than 1 million page views. This thing passed 1 million page views after about a year, and last month it was at the total hits were 12.5 million. So it's an amazing viral thing that's going on with the internet, and we're not the only one. There's other Science 2.0 projects out there. And that's really the future of where it's going. And, you know, to get off this, but it's really an interesting. So anyway, thank you. And are there any questions?
Thank you. So we're recording this, and we have a microphone here. We'd like to ask you to. So I'll ask the question if I can get the mic here.
Oh, he's going to ask me a tough one, too.
Well, no, actually, you asked it yourself right at the beginning and then kind of skipped over it, which was when you observed that increasingly companies were shipping their capital and their fabrication offshore.
Mm-hmm.
So about 6 weeks ago, we had Morris Chang telling us that it was his view that there were really only going to be 3 semiconductor companies in the world really doing serious R&D and semiconductor manufacturing, you know, within a few years. Those 3 companies being, of course, his own company, TSMC,
Right.
naturally, but also in Samsung and Intel. and that was his short list of who's going to be doing R&D in semiconductor manufacturing. So underlying that was this idea that I think that you refer to, which I think is widespread in the U.S. semiconductor industry, that there is a difference between designing chips and manufacturing chips. And whereas in the past it was important to have a certain amount of integration between designing chips and manufacturing chips to be able to produce high volume chips inexpensively, that is no longer the case, that you can now, that the technology is standardized enough that you sacrifice very little by contracting out your manufacturing. And in fact, that has been the trend that's been going on, I think one could argue, right now in the semiconductor industry within the industrialized countries, as opposed to some of the newer entrants. So is this true? Are you making an argument that this is not true? Sort of where do you see this going? And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on where it's all going.
That's actually a different presentation, but and I've actually given this stuff before, and if you go to my stuff on research, look at my blog, you can find look for DFM, stands for Design for Manufacturing. Now, here's an interesting thing. What created the foundries and what made the foundries possible, and Morris Chang was right in the center of it because he was a TI, was what I call the Big Bang of semiconductors, and that was EDA. If you go back to the old days of semiconductors, people would have rooms this big, and they would literally be laying out each mask layer and hand cutting the patterns, creating these high contrast images, taking it down to a photo reduction shop at a print shop, reducing it all down, and then putting it into a photo repeater and making a mask. And EDA comes along. There's two things happen. One is EDA comes along, and then the other one that happens is that we began to create the ability to transfer from a computer, data from a computer, and actually drive an E-beam system, or in those days an optical pattern generator that would then create the mask automatically. And so now, instead of spending months in doing this, and you can imagine today designing 1 billion transistors and hand cutting 40 mask levels, and your layouts would be as big as the United States, so it'd be actually really quite impossible. So what EDA does is EDA begins this separation of process technology from design. And Morris Chang realizes that, goes to Japan, he hooks up with UMC, which had been a spin-off from E-Tree, and then he leaves them and starts TSMC. And that's the beginning of the real foundry industry, because the idea is that you really don't need a semiconductor fab to differentiate your product. You can do it with just the design. And there's a lot of products where a plain vanilla semiconductor process works really well. The problem is that it doesn't work well for everything. Like, the foundries have never made money in memories because it's a completely different manufacturing strategy. And the foundries have never been able to produce a processor at high performance. And what you've seen is the foundry growth has slowed in recent years. And one of the reasons why is as we cross the 100 nanometer barrier, all of a sudden design rules weren't working anymore. And you'd put this whole set of codes in. The way you design a semiconductor, right, today is there's someone that doesn't even know even the electrical part of the chip. They're a programmer. And they write a program to create the design. And then the EDA tool goes through all these hierarchical levels that creates the electrical layout. And then there's the where you can evaluate the timing and stuff like that, and the logical part of the circuit to make sure it does what you think it's going to do. And then there's a whole set of people that then look at the layout and do the floor planning of where everything's going to be, because you have these miles and miles of if you were to blow it up, you have miles and miles of interconnect, and you got to take a signal and you move it from one part of the chip to the other, and so you have a 1, and it's supposed to go to the other part of the chip. It's supposed to be a 1, and that part of the chip is supposed to be synchronous with this part of the chip over here. Well, what happens is it takes a while for the electrons to get from one side of the chip to the other, and so if they get off sequence by just 1 bit, and the clock cycle, all of a sudden you get a timing error and the chip fails to work. And the biggest problem in design today is timing problems, and that's what they spend the biggest part of their time trying to solve. And when we crossed the 100 nanometer barrier, as we went from microchips to nanochips, because that's where you get into nanotechnology when you cross 100 nanometers, according to the guy that originally defined nanotechnology, a Japanese scientist. And forgive me for not remembering his name, but anyway, what happened was all of a sudden the design rules weren't working because you began to get variability in the circuit as some materials were closer to others. And so now you had to go from a design rule-based system to a design model system. And the design model system was based upon a lot of what was going on in the fab. And that's made it more difficult for the foundries because what happened is that in the 90s, you could just go to Applied Materials or Tokyo Electrons. They all had their own development labs, and you could do your process integration. Now it's very difficult to do your process integration. You can get an individual step done, but you can't do process integration. This is why TSMC doesn't have a high K dielectric, which really limits the performance of their 40 to 5 nanometer parts to under a gigahertz. And the other thing that's been really interesting to see is the research. The two people that really tend to be doing the greatest research today on the logic side are IBM and Intel. And TSMC has tended to lag. And if you look at the base of what TSMC produces and the foundries produce, the CDs of what they have been producing is lagging because it's gotten incredibly expensive to design in this nanochip region. In fact, I did a thing here recently on a 45 nanometer design. It was done by this one particular company that makes processors, and not Intel, not AMD also. And it cost them $500 million to do the first design out. 45 mass levels, $500 million. And the biggest problem they had is they couldn't get the DFM models. So if you can't get the DFM models, you can't do the SPICE models for your transistors, which means you really can't do the layout. So you can do only rudimentary design. And so one of the advantages that the IDMs have had, and this is why you saw AMD cleave themselves in two, was no foundry was ever able to make an AMD processor. And because you can't get the performance. A microprocessor fab is like a Ferrari Formula One car. It runs within very tight parameters. If you go to a foundry is like a Honda. It's meant to, or it's like a four-wheel drive. It's meant to take any design that they get. It's very broad scale. So what you've seen is that there's this thing that keeps on going about the foundries. It's slowed to quite an extent, but we've also had a lot of these other issues, like the fact that a lot of people, a fab is a $3 billion entity today. It's just a huge expense. And even TSMC is not investing in the leading edge anymore. If you look at last year, their capital spending was mostly on 130 nanometer, 90 nanometer, 8-inch stuff that was used because they could save a lot of money, and that's where most of their customers are designing today because it's too expensive to design below that. So it looks like we've got a whole bunch of questions now.
Sure. Sorry. So what concerns me about the rate of innovation and how it may be potentially impacted is the EDA environment and the model for my friends who have been in EDA, Cadence and Mentor and such, not really innovating as much themselves, but buying the startups.
Right.
And so there's a whole dynamic, and I know you know this, and you couldn't reflect this level of complexity in this level of charts, but I'd just love to talk to you or hear more about your views about where you think EDA is going, and do you think it's falling off a cliff, or maybe just saying it's leveling off? And that could be a leading problem that has a 10-year hence huge implication, because what I agree with you. We used to say what yesterday's simplifying assumptions just no longer hold, and that's progressively tightening. And so those key tools to let people do noise analysis, for example, and
Right.
coupling, and now getting into the inductive effects, right? Who can afford to do that when the limit of the number of software licenses for Cadence and Mentor is maybe 3 companies or 4 that can afford it?
Yeah.
They just can't sell enough volumes.
And plus, a lot of them don't do any research. They just buy what's out there.
Right.
And the model has been some venture capitalist is going to come along and fund a startup, and then they'll buy it. No, you're absolutely right. In fact, EDA has been one of the most interesting things to look at because, and I've done a fair amount of work in sort of the economics of that, and the population of designers grows, the population of the world grows, of this country grows at about 1% a year, and the population of designer is sub 1% a year. If the industry is growing revenues at 17% per year, that means that somehow, and if the complexity is doubling every 2 years, the productivity of designers in terms of transistors they can design has to be exploding with Moore's law. Well, here's the interesting thing: about 5, 6 years ago, when we went through the Y2K thing, the productivity to designers stopped, and it's because the company's been beating up the EDA companies. They've not had the funding to do the research, so the software's not been coming, and so what's happening is, and there's also becoming a big gap between companies like IBM and Intel that have their own high-end tools that overlay on top, that do all that modeling that you're talking about, that overlay on top of the synopsises and cadences. And you know, people say, why do they have their own design tools? Well, they actually don't have their own design tools. They're buying everybody else's that's the commodity stuff, and then they're laying all of their stuff on top of that that makes their chips really perform like crazy. And so and that's becoming another factor that's weeding out a lot of the other companies. And if you look at the fabless sector, you still see people like Qualcomm at the leading edge, Xilinx, people like that have high volumes, but the large, you know, the 500 plus fabless companies that are out there are really struggling with dealing with design today. And part of it is because we've really hurt the EDA companies. So you're absolutely right. I agree 100%. In fact, I have got some charts that you can find on the site that show designer productivity over time and how it was following Moore's law and how it bottomed out. And then part of my point is that if you look at the total number of designs coming out of the industry, it's slowed. And we're actually producing fewer designs per year today than we produced 10 years ago. And hello, you know, like, the ASPs of chips are the lowest ever. The profitability of the industry is the lowest ever. And that's what I've been talking about all night. It's innovation. You know, it's all about innovation. And because we're not innovating, we're not creating these new designs, we're not creating the value. So looks like we had some questions in the back too. Yeah.
I have a question. You spoke about vertically disintegrated R&D before, and you've seen that start in the pharmaceutical industry where a lot of the discovery in the earlier stages of R&D are done by small biotech companies, and then they pass it off to the larger pharmaceutical companies for development and the clinical trials and production. But you're now starting to see these patent thickets arise because all these biotech companies patent their discoveries so that they can capture downstream value. But this is actually, some people say it's starting to slow the innovation process because now there's only one company who has that patent and they can do whatever they want with it, but they're not going to let anybody else do it. So my question for you is, what are some potential mechanisms for capturing value when you have other people doing your discovery and your earlier innovation, earlier R&D?
It is a huge intellectual property management issue, and I'm just beginning to get into the pharmaceutical side because of the research. For years I've done just semiconductors. It's interesting to see pharmaceutical side of things because they are actually doing, there's a lot of very similar stuff with what they do. They're coming to the same conclusions. If you look at the return on research and the amount of R&D spending in the pharmaceutical industry versus their returns, it's actually, they used to be one of the best industries. Today it's one of the lowest. It's one of the poorest performing industries. And yet we're seeing drug costs go through the roof. And so there's a lot of issues there. The other problem that you had is the big pharmaceutical companies made a strategic error about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that put them in the position that they're in today, where they have to go to these small biotech companies. And if you look at the way research is done in the pharmaceutical industry, basically you start off with a target disease that you're looking for, and you look for a molecule that then you can find another molecule that binds to it and somehow takes the disease away. And that's a very simple model. But it turns out that it's very easy to identify those two molecules. The pharmaceutical industry had this idea that, well, we would have these massive vats of stuff, and we'd just create all these random combinations, and eventually we'd hit the right combination for this other molecule to attach onto this. Well, the biotech companies looked at it and says, no, it's actually a lot better if you know what this is and you know what all the bonds are. Why don't you just go design that molecule and then try to find something that matches it? And so you have the creation, Genentech's really the first biotech company, and that's really been the difference between those two. And so I think they're sorting out this whole infrastructural issue, because the pharmaceutical companies have the sales and distribution ability, and then the biotech companies really have the knowledge and the IP. And a lot of the and there's this battle between who's going to get the profits, and meanwhile, SG&A marketing in the pharmaceutical companies has exploded because of the ability to advertise. And so, if you look at their return on S, it's been declining because they've been trying to push through and drive patients to go to doctors and say, I want this drug or I want that drug. And so you've got lots of issues there. So I'm not really sure how it's going to resolve itself out. In the semiconductor industry, what happened was everybody had so many corresponding patents that they just sort of gave up and signed licenses with each other that we'll allow you to use this and somebody else can use that. There's not a lot of people in the semiconductor industry historically shied away from IP, and it's just only become a thing where you actually have independent IP companies driving it. In the pharmaceutical industry, most of the costs start in the phase 3 trials. And it's kind of interesting now, because the real work today in trying to cut the cost of research in pharmaceutical companies is to push your kill ratio to very high levels at the beginning of the R&D cycle. And it is a lot more random, because you have you have the one molecule, and so what you really want to do is very quickly ascertain whether or not you can come up with this other molecule, and if you can't, just kill that project. Because the last thing you want to do is be in phase 3 and find out that it doesn't work, and at all. And the hard part is, once you get the two molecules working, you usually come up with a whole bunch of alternatives, but then the problem is that finding out how it interacts with the human body and with the whole sampling of the population, which is its own big problem. And the real change that's occurring now is something called personalized medicine. And follow up on what Genentech did with Herceptin too, because it's really an amazing process. It's the first drug that came out that requires a genetic test for you to get the drug. And originally they were going to kill the drug. And the FDA said, well, if we look at the whole population of women, it's a thing for breast cancer. If we look at the whole population, it's only beneficial for about 30% of women. So this drug does not have much efficacy at all. We're going to kill it. And then the next thing that happened was the guys that were doing the research, the professor down in Southern California, figured out that there was this marker called HER2. That's why it's called Herceptin, genetic marker. That if you took the women that had the HER2 genetic marker, over 90% of them were cured by this drug. Now, the biggest problem they had was the FDA says, well, it has to work for the whole population. And they're thinking statistics, and someone had to teach them something about, well, you need to get the right sample of the relevant people. But they were able to do that, and so today you have this drug, and the research started in like 1982. But it's actually amazing. This whole thing has hit our society so much that there's actually Lifetime did a movie on it recently. and it's pretty hard to find someone doing a movie on researchers, but it's a pretty fascinating thing, and apparently the movie is pretty true to life. And but the pharmaceutical industry is definitely going through this very same problem. It's a very global industry, maybe even more global than the semiconductor industry, and because the development is so global. So it's going to be interesting, and I think that I mean, people in this room are going to have a lot of opportunity to go solve those problems. Yeah, in the back.
You spoke of Xerox Corporation Research Lab at Palo Alto, California, and I worked for the Xerox for 28 years as a marketeer. Now, we were told that we invented the mouse. Is this unique that someone would invent something so significant and then know what to do with it? And were there other significant developments that came out of there?
Well, there was also the GUI, the graphical user interface, Ethernet. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that came out of there. In fact, I have some good friends that are retired that I go up to their place every once in a while in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and we go hiking, and they both were researchers at Xerox PARC, and they just said it was so frustrating because we'd invent this stuff and it wouldn't go anywhere. It's actually very typical of that era. RCA developed the flat panel display, the liquid crystal display technology. It was all developed at RCA. They had it, and they put it on a shelf, and the Japanese took it and created a whole industry out of it. The AT&T invents the transistor. They were actually forced by the government to give out the technology, but they never took their lead in understanding the materials properties to turn it into a real business, and they let other people take that business. And it was very typical of those days because the researchers tended to be in their own silos, solving problems that they were interested in solving, not necessarily associated to the marketing. And so you would have and if you look at classical marketing, I've tried to create a whole discipline of marketing that's related around product development, because if you look at what you learn in school about marketing, it's all about advertising and understanding the customer, what's going to appeal to the customer, and mind share games, and you basically hit them with all these ads so that when they walk up to that cooler and they're going Coke, Pepsi, Coke, you've given them enough advertising, they pull Coke down, and you've made your sale. As opposed to really when you look at something very complex like developing a product like the Apple iPhone or the Apple iPod, I mean, Apple is brilliant at this because they find the problem. What was the problem that created the iPod? The MP3 player had existed for 3 or 4 years. Everybody had tried to build a business out of it, and what they were doing was selling hardware. And Jobs went in and looked at, well, here's the problem. In fact, it was in Sony's lap because Sony had Sony Pictures and Sony Media, and then they had their MP3 player people. And the people on the legal side were saying, no, you can't sell this MP3 player because we're not going to give you rights to get the songs and everything, and we don't want to lose all this IP. And Jobs looked at it and says, the problem is, by the way, I don't know if Morris told you this, but at TSMC they call the legal department the business prevention department. And the problem was it was a legal issue of how do we get the IP over to make this and get the software, because everybody had seen Napster and the value destruction that it created, in theory anyway. And so what Jobs did was, as he said, the problem is not the hardware or that the market's not there because people want these MP3 players. The hard part is creating a business model around which you can allow people to get the songs, the song companies get their money, so their business remains viable, and I can create these iPods. So he creates iTunes. And the brilliance of what he did was he linked the hardware with the web, with the internet, and made it possible to align all of those various interests and made it happen. iPhone has completely redesigned the world of phones, and it's ripping apart the whole phone world. And at first people looked at it and they said, well, this is just it doesn't have any buttons. What's wrong with it? It has to have buttons. And And by the way, you saw that volcano at the beginning? I actually lost my iPhone in that volcano a year ago. Pele needed it, and then I went back and I replaced it with a BlackBerry because the keypad on the iPhone is not that good. And then I also was able to write a review of both of them, so that was kind of cool. But the interesting thing about this is what we've seen is this proliferation of keys and the screen, right? And the beauty of the iPhone is because your buttons are programmable, you can change your programs to the application. So when you start to look at convergence of all of these crazy applications that get packed into a phone, the only way you can do that is one of these capacitive displays. And what Jobs saw was that in order to do all these applications, the problem was you couldn't get, the design didn't work. And so the whole issue was, how do you integrate all of these, the complexity of the software, the hardware, and then get it, and what does the customer need? A very good example of a failure was a Nokia phone that I had quite a few years ago. And Nokia created this great thing that they had an IR port on the phone that you could then communicate with your PC's IR port, and you could use your phone as a modem. Really cool thing, except for one thing. The wireless antenna on the Nokia wanted it to be upright in order to get good reception. The infrared needed the phone to be flat. So it didn't work. And so what you see in some of these companies is, even in the marketing case, they add the features, but they don't have the development guys connected to the end market. And sometimes they don't even have their own development people connected. Like if you look at Microsoft Vista, it was the first program that was ever designed that Bill Gates didn't look at every line of code. And they basically, there was one team that was tasked with, when you open it up, we want it to start up instantly. And they created this code, and you could open it up, and it opened up instantly, just like the MacBook Air. And then there was another team that was doing the whole Wi-Fi part of it and the internet connection. Well, that team made it so that it wouldn't turn on until it found the Wi-Fi connection. And so all these other teams are doing all this other tasking that the computer has to do before it can give you a screen and let you start working. And because none of these teams were talking, you have this disaster that's been a real mess for everybody. So the management of research, I think, is going to be one of the great paradigms of this century in terms of how the industrialized countries stay ahead economically of places like China. Because I just don't believe that, when you look at tennis shoes and you say the cost of making a tennis shoe is $2, and the sports stars that do the sales and marketing and represent the tennis shoes make more money than all the people that are making the tennis shoes, that it's a right model for Americans to be doing that kind of manufacturing. It's all about innovation. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question. I think you got him first, right behind you.
I want to revisit the manufacturing side of it. It kind of makes sense to see the relation between Science 2.0 and innovation and market and research and everything. But how does it reflect on manufacturing? Because maybe if you explain this fab light a little bit more, it would make more sense for me. Is it going to be like, for example, there's going to be design companies now? What AMD did, like divide its manufacturing and just get rid of that, and going to be doing design now, and in the future is going to be like all foundries alone and design companies over there. And what kind of model do you predict for the future?
That's actually a very complex question, and we're actually I'm running a panel at the ISME conference in a couple of days on that very topic of, is manufacturing viable in the G7 countries? And I could spend a lot of time explaining fab light and fabless and all this, but the basic concept is, the companies that do fab light, what they're doing is they're spinning off their ability to manufacture at the leading edge, because they can't afford to build a fab anymore. And yet what they try to do is they try to continue to develop in order to keep the world thinking that they're on the leading edge. The problem is if you develop a process in one fab, and then you design, you can't use the DFM model from that fab. You have to use the DFM model from the fab you're going to process your silicon on. So you're not going to get any yield. And that's been the problem of the fab light model is it's more of a way of dealing with legal issues of whether you can lay people off or not, and just the whole issue of that. And what was smart about AMD is the real problem is you don't have enough money to build a fab. So they said, we're just going to leave the company. We're going to find someone else that has money to build a fab. They're going to go make that investment, and we'll be two companies, and we'll solve our cash problem. Has to see if it works, but it's a really innovative approach to solving this issue. And so that's kind of thing. When it comes to the cost of manufacturing, it doesn't really matter where you manufacture anymore when it comes to semiconductors. It's so automated. The issue is not, the real issue is who's going to fund you and who's going to help you get along, like New York State giving you money to help you get in and build your factory or whatnot. So the direct labor in a fab is very low. The engineering labor there's still a difference there, but even that has been narrowing, and in a lot of places like Shanghai, getting a good tech they're more expensive than they are here in Silicon Valley. So because there's so few of them with experience, because you had such a manufacturing boom there. So it's possible, but the key thing, the point between the development and the manufacturing is manufacturing has to enable differentiation in the end product. If it doesn't, it should just be focused on cost. And the companies that focused their manufacturing on cost in the 80s and 90s, they lost that ability to differentiate from manufacturing, and eventually their managements came in and said, you're toast, we're moving this overseas because you're not cost competitive with these factories overseas. And besides, we don't have the $3 billion to spend on a new factory. I think we had another question in here. Yeah, right here.
Thanks. You mentioned Sony's failure to capitalize on its vast IP library and its MP3 players as an example of the legal department being the business prevention department. And as a future IP lawyer, I'm kind of curious how the IP department can help leverage and create value for a business in ways, and I guess examples other than Apple, where that has been implemented and successful.
Actually, Apple's a really great thing of understanding, what the IP issues were, what the legal IP issues were, and I think one of the things that has to evolve here is the legal side of things, because what tends to happen in companies is legal tries to minimize risk, and the whole point of business is to take on risk. The whole point of innovation is to take on risk. And when you start to look at negotiation to go on, most of the time the negotiations are over these stinky little clauses that never get accessed anyway. And then the most important thing's about how are you going to work together as two companies when you're trying to work together and develop some sort of a cross-license, like in the biological case of who's going to develop the technology and what are they going to get in terms of license fees for that? How are they going to continue to be able to be an engine, and who's going to be the distribution channel for that product? And who's going to carry it through all the phase 3 files? And I think that the pharmaceutical industry is actually behind semiconductors because they're behind it on cost, and so they've not had to deal with this. But when it comes to the IP thing, if you look at the MP3 process, it was a matter of looking at, okay, what are the legal issues with dealing with the technology which has moved ahead of where our legal rules are, and then moving those IP issues ahead with it, and making it possible to come up with a license that the record companies and the IP owners are happy with. They're saying, we're going to make money on this deal. And the hardware people are saying, we're going to make money on this deal. And also moving it within the time to market needs that you run into in technology today. Because if you spend a year negotiating to get a contract that's going to wind up in a filing cabinet it's really not value. And to be honest, if I was in your shoes, I don't think I'd want to create a bunch of paper that never gets used. I think I'd want to create value out there that actually creates things, makes possible things like the iPod and technologies like that, by finding ways to streamline the negotiation process and to focus the negotiation on the stuff that really matters to the company, and dealing with the risk issues that everybody has to deal with, like what happens if there's an earthquake or those sorts of things, and the indemnity. It's gotten insane. A lot of times I can't do anything because I can't deal with the indemnity issues. And for stuff that's really silly that's never going to happen. Like when you try to use a server farm these days, they won't take any indemnity for your stuff. Well, if you're Microsoft, you can come in and force them to take indemnity because they want your business. If you're a small company, you can't do that. And so there's a lot of issues like that I think that the legal community can really make a big difference in. And the whole point of the law is to keep people from standing in the streets and shooting each other down, right? It's supposed to create peace, and so that's what we really need to work on there. And I think that's where, you could really add a lot of value in the future. Yeah, Becky. You're going to have to shut me up here because I'll go on all night.
I'm getting hungry. I was actually interested to merge both of those questions. You had a slide that talked about the innovation coming forth from universities and then the right role in R&D for companies. One of the reservoirs, is how I like to think of them, of innovation that I wasn't sure where you would put them, would be the national labs, or whether you think they have a role anymore in that basic kind of R&D. And then to tie those things in with this question, my suggestion would be that you innovate and create a fixed price to get a patent filed model. Because then you are aligned with the urgency that your business clients have to get something out the door. And I think that misalignment, I've run several teams of IP lawyers, and that misalignment, very basic misalignment between how the legal community works and how the business community works, is the root of a lot of unnecessary stress and tension.
Yeah. It sounds like you give a whole talk on that. Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time messing with that. So the question I had was, A, where would you put the labs? And B, the free flow of information, which I sense is underlying this Science 2.0.
Well, that's the whole point.
The free flow of innovation.
Is ideas create ideas. They're creative, and you get this viral growth of ideas the more access people have to information and to what's going on in different parts of the world. It's like the use of snake venom to develop new drugs for heart ACPs or whatever, I forget what they're called. But anyway, there was this Brazilian student, doctoral student that came up here, and he brought some of the snake venom with him, and he said, and they were looking for this one molecule to dissolve it. And he says, I got exactly that molecule, and it's from this very poisonous snake that they have down in South America. They take it, they go, this is really great, except for one thing. The FDA hasn't approved us to use this. So they had to take the venom, and move him and the research team to England because England would allow them to do the research. This is a huge loss, when you think about what happens there. So now, coming back to your question about the national labs, the national labs were created for defense. And they actually they're focused on development and research that drives the specific development. Now, the interesting thing about defense is it's far more easy to destroy something than it is to build something. I mean, I know exactly what a tank needs to do. And I know exactly what needs to do to improve that tank, whether it needs to be the vulnerability or the targeting ability or whatever. This is all very, very clear. It's crystal clear. Knowing what to do with the iPod and how to make the MP3 player work and build a business out of that is much more difficult. And And so that's always been the problem. And the national labs create tremendous amounts of research, but you have this problem of how do you ever merge these two cultures of a very secretive, closed culture that's developing defense work with a culture of a very open culture that's pre-competitive that you see that occurs in university types of research. And so I think it's very difficult for those two to work, and I think the national labs have their place in defense, but
So the answer is you don't see
I've
them
not seen them have a place
on
in the
your-
commercial world. I can't, there's very few things that I've seen that they've been able to kind of lever into the commercial world. I mean, every time I see a presentation about the stuff they've done, is just like the little radar things on the back of our cars that tell us when we're backing up and we might hit something. You know, I mean, that's kind of neat, but it's not this great invention that's earth-shattering like fire and forget targeting that they created, and behind that, and the ability to, you know, hit the targets you're actually aiming at. It's really interesting, the stuff in World War II, all the bombs they dropped, like almost nothing ever hit any strategic targets. It was hitting everything else but the target they were aiming at. So it's a, you know, it's really two different purposes that you're tasking into. And I think it's hard to have people work on towards one objective, which is defense, that's very clear, very secretive, and another one that's basic research, like trying to find the quark and the last quarks, and doing a superconducting collider, and finding stuff that you're just seeking knowledge. And you want that sort of stuff to be open because you want other people to figure it out, and it creates value longer term. So that's, and so I don't really, I think the national labs are, the attempt to try and commercialize them is probably a waste of time, but that's, I would have to really sit down with them and see I'd like to see a business plan from them as how they're going to do this, and then drive holes through it and figure out how they do it. But I think that they've got a fundamental problem. It's just like when you read what Welch talked about when he tried to acquire an investment bank. And at the end of the day, he wound up selling it off because he couldn't merge the two cultures of the GE, which was leasing and banking, with this very high risk, high mobility investment type bank that you see on Wall Street. And so he backed out of it. Yeah, I think we have a question in the back.
With the new with the semiconductor industry, I mean, having a history of 50 years, like you said, it has created a new market for its research itself that we can see. But when you take semiconductor industry itself, and with an amount of players coming in and with a lot of competition and innovation going on, do you see that the industry itself is in maturity stage, or is it in saturation right now?
I love that question. Is it in the maturity phase? There's actually not a lot of competitors coming in anymore. That's pretty much history. I always wonder what maturity is. I've never found an economic definition for it. Do you have one, Ken? In terms of the growth, it's definitely beyond its high growth phase. If you look at the electronics, it grows at 6% a year. If you look at semiconductors, it grows at about 6% a year. If you look at the nominal GDP, it grows at about 6% a year once you add inflation back in. So it's basically growing with the economy. So by that definition, I would say it's mature, but it's certainly not mature like the auto industry, which is growing at 1 to 2% per year, and now down. So it is, in that sense, a mature industry, but I have a hard time with that whole definition. And the other thing is that you would call retail mature, but one of the biggest revolutions in the last 10 to 15 years has been Walmart. And what did they do? They did a whole technological revolution of the business model of how you do retail, and using software and computers and all this to optimize the distribution process. So their maturity is something that I think is very debatable. And as and the Walmart story reminds me of a guy that I used to work out with in this gym that I was working out with. And I actually didn't work out with him, but we always worked out near each other. And he was in his 90s. And he used to tell me that the only difference between being old and young is how stiff you are in the morning. And I think that's the maturity. If it's really, your mind doesn't change, you're still going to be innovative. And if Walmart can innovate, you can still innovate in the semiconductor industry. And with that, I think I'll close it off.
Thank you.